Magandang umaga, Pilipinas! Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining around the world. Welcome to today's webinar where we will try to solve agriculture dissonance, setting directions through change leadership. We are streaming to you live to the SEARCA online learning and virtual engagements or SOLVE platform via Zoom and Facebook Live. My name is Jean Labios, and I am a program specialist of the Training for Development Unit under the Education and Collective Learning Department of SEARCA. I will be your moderator for this morning's webinar. The short video shown earlier has given you a glimpse about SEARCA and what we do. SEARCA is hosted by the Philippine government in the campus of the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. So we are coming to you live from Los Baños, Laguna, the special science and nature city of the Philippines. This SOLVE webinar is SEARCA's immediate response to the emerging impacts of the COVID-19 global pandemic on food security by maximizing the use of information and communication technology platforms to inform, educate, and share evidence-based solutions and tested technologies, as well as best practices on the ground. If you are new to this webinar, this is actually the 31st webinar since it was launched last year, April 28. Today, we will be joined by 3 experts who will share their experiences on what it takes to be a transformational leader for agriculture and rural development, as well as the lessons learned and challenges faced while serving at the forefront of their respective fields. SEARCA's 11th 5-year plan, which was launched in July 2020, identifies transformational leadership for agriculture and rural development, or ARD, as one of the priority areas that would accelerate transformation through agricultural innovation. Before we proceed to our online conversation this morning, please allow me to quickly go over some statistics gathered from the SOLVE webinar held on May 26, 2021. The infograph shows that 64% of our online viewers were female and the rest were male. It also indicates that 119 individuals tuned in via Zoom and 200 plus individuals viewed the webinar through SEARCA's Facebook page. Lastly, we are happy to note that we've had online attendees not only from the Philippines, but also from Indonesia and Myanmar. Let me now go over the program flow, which is currently shown on your screen. After my introduction and a few housekeeping rules, we will first have our first speaker, Dr. Dennis Garrity, Drylands Ambassador for the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, Senior Fellow at the World Resources Institute, and Distinguished Senior Research Fellow at World Agroforestry, or ICRAF, Nairobi. Dr. Garrity will open our discussion this morning by discussing how transforming agriculture needs leadership. Dr. Dindo Campilan, Regional Director for Asia and Hub Director for Oceania of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, follows with his presentation about his reflections on learning change leadership. Lastly, but definitely not the least, we will have Ms. Jade Dyson, Director of the Grain and Feed Trade Association, or GAFTA, Singapore, and President of WOMAG. She will share with us her experience in setting up WOMAG, a woman-run and volunteer-led association of professional women and men committed to creating an inclusive community of food and agribusiness professionals. I know you're all excited to listen to our speakers, but let me first encourage you to send us your questions. How do you do this? For those of you who are tuned in via SEARCA's Facebook page, you may type your questions in the comments section. Kindly indicate your location now and or country of origin. If you are tuned in via Zoom, please post your questions or comments in the Q&A box, which you would find in the menu bar on your screen. Kindly indicate your location and or country of origin as well. Our SOLVE team will collate, curate, and compile those questions for me, and I will convey them to our speakers. Hopefully, we will be able to cover as many questions as we can in the time remaining. Please be clear when you are posing a question to a specific presenter, or if it is a general question that anybody can respond to. We will do our best to get as many questions as possible during the open forum. Kindly refrain from posting your email address in the comments section. You can provide this information to us upon responding to our evaluation form and e-certificate request. The link will be posted at the end of the webinar. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and will be made available on SEARCA's Facebook page and YouTube channel. Today's presentations will be uploaded on SEARCA's website at www.searca.org. The slides shown during the past webinars have already been posted there. For your social media posts, especially on insights or takeaways from this webinar, please use the hashtag SEARCASolve. If you have issues or are experiencing technical difficulties with the Zoom online platform, please contact us at solve@searca.org. Moving on to today's discussions, our first speaker this morning is Dr. Dennis Garrity. He is a systems agronomist and research leader whose career has been focused on the development of small-scale farming systems in the tropics. He has been serving as Drylands ambassador for the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, emphasizing the role of agroforestry, evergreen agriculture, and land care as critical to sustainable land management. He is a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute and distinguished senior research fellow at the World Agroforestry, ICRAF, in Nairobi. He served as Director General of the Center from 2001 to 2011. He is currently focusing on building a global and land restoration movement and is leading an effort to perennialize global agriculture in the 21st century. He is chairman of the board of the Global Evergreening Alliance, a partnership of nearly all of the major development and conservation organizations around the world, working together on a transformation of African and Asian farming through the integration of trees into farming systems, degraded forest lands, and rangelands. He also chairs the steering committee for Land Care International, a worldwide effort to support grassroots community-based natural resource management. During the 1980s, he led the agroecology unit of the International Rice Research Institute, and he initiated and developed the Southeast Asia program of the World Agroforestry Center during the 1990s while based in Bogor, Indonesia. He is a native of Ohio, USA, and he obtained his Bachelor's of Science degree in agronomy at the Ohio State University. He obtained his Master in Science in Farming Systems at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, and his PhD in agronomy at the University of Nebraska. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Dennis Garrity.
Thank you, Jean, for this introduction, and hello, everybody. It's an honor to join Dindo and Jade to speak with you today about change leadership in agriculture, to address the huge challenges coming at us in the coming years. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself and my life's journey in agriculture. Then I will tell you a little bit about the coming global climate catastrophe that together we are now facing. And then I want to tell you a little bit about the kind of leadership that we need from you to get us out of this ditch. Well, I'm actually nearly 70 years old now, but when I was a young man in high school, I read a book that changed my life and set the direction for my career in agricultural development. The book was called Famine 1975. It was written in the mid-1960s by Paul and William Paddock, two agronomists who foresaw a terrible situation unfolding, and they were determined to alert the world to what it was and what had to be done about it. This title says it all, Famine 1975, that the world was facing a time of terrible famines that would affect the lives and survival of hundreds of millions of people. The authors were seeing that during the 1960s, the rate of population growth had been accelerating to a much faster rate than had ever occurred before. And it had reached the point where food production was beginning to fall desperately behind demand. I saw this for myself in India when I lived there in 1971. The country was falling way behind in food production, but India was very poor and it couldn't afford to buy the food it needed to fill the deficit. It was receiving about 20 million tons of food per year as aid from the United States. Southeast Asia faced a similar crisis. And when I visited the Philippines in 1972, the government had mandated that maize grits be mixed with rice because there just wasn't enough rice available to meet the country's needs. Clearly, a terrific push was absolutely imperative to boost food production in Asia, or disaster was on the horizon. Fortunately, there was leadership and there was science available to cope with the crisis. A new generation of dwarf varieties of wheat and rice were just in the final stages of being developed that would revolutionize food grain production on the continent just in the nick of time. Dr. M.S. Swaminathan and his colleagues led this effort in India. The new wheat varieties swept through the country in the early 1970s, and a decade later, by the early 1980s, India had somewhat miraculously attained self-sufficiency in basic food grain production. The crisis was overcome. Likewise, and simultaneously, the International Rice Research Institute led an all-out effort in the Philippines to develop a new type of dwarf rice variety that doubled or tripled the yield of conventional rices. And as these varieties were rapidly taken up by farmers, the threat of famine receded here as well. It was a crisis, and that crisis was addressed by innovative scientists who rose to the challenge and provided leadership to create a new technology when it was most direly needed. But it was also a leadership of government policymakers who saw the need to ramp up investment in agriculture and get the technology out to millions of farmers as quickly as possible. And it was a leadership of agricultural extension professionals who mobilized to reach the farm gate with the new technologies so that millions of farmers could take advantage of them. This massive effort succeeded, and the famines were avoided. And in this area, and in this era of Asian agriculture, it was deemed the Green Revolution. Now today, ladies and gentlemen, we are facing another crisis of a similar magnitude. Actually, one that is more serious by far. And to address it, we will need an evergreen revolution. We've all heard about the climate crisis. It is truly a climate emergency, and it's becoming increasingly clear that the scale of suffering that could occur if we do not overcome it will be desperately greater than what was projected in the 1960s. As the director of the Potsdam Institute has said, if we continue down the present path, there's every likelihood, every risk that we will just end our civilization. The human species will survive somehow, but we will destroy almost everything we have built up in the last 2,000 years. A pretty stark warning, no? Let me provide now a bit of background on the existential predicament that we're facing today, the basis for this conclusion. Global heating is now approaching 1.2 degrees, and it is accelerating year by year. This is what is so worrisome. The 1.5 degrees C warming target that was the basis of the Paris Agreement is likely to be achieved decades earlier than was projected. And that would be by at least 2030. 2 degrees C, which was the upper limit of the Paris Agreement, is now likely to occur before the middle of the century. This, I'm afraid, is very dangerous. 2 degrees C may trigger a hothouse Earth scenario of self-reinforcing warming due to tipping points like the permafrost melting and others that cannot be controlled by humans in the future. The world is actually on a 3 to 5 degree warming path by 2100. And I'm afraid that 3 degrees of warming would be simply catastrophic. As Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has warned us, the climate emergency is evolving faster than predicted. We must accelerate our response with ambition and urgency. This is the battle of our lives. Now, let's talk about the critical action that is needed. The fact is that zero emissions must be achieved at emergency speed by 2030, not by 2050. That is the crucial time frame. The Earth is already too hot and will continue to get hotter even if fossil fuel emissions go to zero very rapidly. That is why we need large-scale carbon drawdown absolutely essential. And we need adaptation actions that protect the most vulnerable. So this is where your leadership comes in, to internalize the significance of what we know is happening, to understand what needs to be done, and to do everything possible to exert leadership, to redirect agriculture, to cope with the situation, and to contribute to overcoming the challenge. I chair the board of the Global Evergreening Alliance. The Alliance now has over 50 member organizations, which include virtually all of the biggest development and conservation NGOs in the world, as well as many regional, national, and local organizations, and also key research organizations that provide technical support. The Alliance's mission is to achieve massive impact in land restoration globally and pull down massive amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It has mobilized its members and partners in the United Nations and in governments throughout the world to implement regional and national restoration programs. We knew that we needed to do more than simply engage in restoration. We needed to spearhead a big, audacious goal to inspire action at all levels, from the global right down to the individual community, to take urgent action on restoration and climate change. The evidence shows clearly the enormous potential for nature-based solutions, including many, many in agriculture, to be a cornerstone of the carbon dioxide drawdown effort. We added up the streams of realistic possibilities, and we established the goal to be capturing 20 billion tons of additional carbon dioxide from the atmosphere every year by mid-century, while improving livelihoods and caring better for the land. That goal is the basis for the Evergreening the Earth Green Up to Cool Down campaign, which was launched at the United Nations a year and a half ago. And we are determined to achieve it. This graph shows the drastic rate at which global emissions must attain to even hope to stave off the catastrophe. I have also added in the annual absorption of carbon dioxide from the oceans and the land base. Together, they are already drawing down about 20 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year, which makes it possible for the world to achieve net zero emissions by about 2040. The campaign projects that an acceleration of landscape restoration with nature-based solutions is already starting to enable the drawdown of that additional 20 billion tons of carbon dioxide that have already been deposited in the atmosphere. By succeeding in the Evergreening the Earth campaign, we will be well into negative emissions territory in mid-century. In fact, we must be into negative emissions territory, as shown by the blue zone at the bottom of the graph. So below the line is the drawdown, and above the line is the projected emissions with drastic reduction in fossil fuel use. Now, there are a couple of billion hectares of degraded lands around the world, much of that in agriculture, that could be the focus of such restoration efforts. The areas of such lands are particularly widespread in Southeast and South Asia. So how does this restoration happen in ways that benefit local communities? Our global evergreening goal is made up of target areas for capturing and storing more carbon in the world's landscapes and can reduce agricultural emissions. We've laid out unique strategies for all of the ecosystems: degraded farmlands, degraded forest lands, and degraded rangeland restoration. We must imagine how rice lands and other croplands in Asia and their surrounding watersheds may play a role in this evergreening transformation. It might encompass, for example, how farming with high-value tree crops, such as these mangoes grown in rice fields and other perennials, might play a role in this transformation to diversification of agriculture, to greater resilience of agriculture to climate change, and to much greater capture and drawdown of carbon from the atmosphere. And it will certainly involve changing rice production practices to decrease the emission of methane in rice fields while increasing production and or decreasing production costs. Technologies such as wet dry rice production practices are examples of such technologies. The focus of leadership should also take a whole watershed approach, an approach that looks at how watershed restoration can not only store vast amounts of carbon, which could offset the high levels of methane emissions from rice fields, but such catchment protection could also provide for a sustainable supply of water resources for rice production itself and increase the resilience of agricultural production systems. Thus, there is a rich set of opportunities to imagine and to spearhead. In conclusion, it will be up to you to lead and to act as if the fate of future generations depended upon it, because they do. Just as did the agricultural leaders of the Green Revolution. To be a leader, you have to deeply believe that you can contribute to solving the problem and that what you do really counts. And then you dedicate yourself fully to solving that problem, together in league with many partners and colleagues. Ladies and gentlemen, we need your leadership now, like never before. Thank you for listening. Onwards. And back to you, Jean.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Garrity, for your presentation. We note your call to action and challenge to take the necessary steps and initiatives to face and address the climate emergency. I especially like the evergreening campaign of greening up to cool down. For our next speaker, we have Dr. Dindo Campilan. He works for the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, as Regional Director for Asia and the Hub Director for Oceania. IUCN, the world's oldest and largest environmental organization, is the global authority on the status of nature and the measures needed to safeguard it. Dr. Kampilan is based in Bangkok, Thailand, and manages IUCN's program and operations in 49 countries in Asia and Oceania, and leads a team of nearly 300 experts and support staff members through a network of 11 offices across the region. He has over 20 years of Asia-wide program management and experience in agriculture, food, and environment research and development with the CGIAR and the United Nations. He held regional leadership positions for the CGIAR while posted in the Philippines, China, India, and Vietnam. He was Asia Regional Director at the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, or CIAT, and managed an 18-country portfolio on inclusive markets, sustainable food systems, and climate-smart agriculture. Prior to IUCN, Dr. Kampilan worked with the UN International Labour Organization, or ILO, as Senior Program and Operations Officer for Small and Medium Enterprises, particularly for the UN-wide COVID-19 response and recovery efforts in Myanmar. Dr. Kampilan holds a PhD from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Dr. Kampilan, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be joining SEARCA's webinar again. And thanks to my other co-speakers today and to all of you who are connecting either to Zoom or Facebook Live. When I was asked by SEARCA to join today's webinar, I was a bit hesitant, especially talking about leadership and change leadership. And it's a reason why my title is about learning change leadership by necessity and opportunity, because I've never really studied formally about leadership. It was simply by necessity and opportunity that throughout all these years, I've taken all these leadership roles. And every day is a constant process of learning. I'm also happy to follow Dennis's presentation, given that it builds on many of the key points that he's talked about in relation to leadership in agriculture and in sustainability. Today, I also add a more personal touch to it by reflecting on some of my own experiences in the past 20 years or so throughout my professional life, starting with the CGIAR, the ILO, and now with IUCN. I'll start by introducing my organization. Many of you knew me from my previous lives in agriculture, especially in the CJ area. But currently, and I work for IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature. We are largely known for species conservation, red list, or more recently for green list in relation to protected and conserved areas. But we do have a much broader mandate that covers from business and biodiversity to World Heritage sites. And this is the scope of the work that I'm leading here in Asia and Oceania. Now, as we talk about change leadership today, we can refer back to the different challenges that each of these themes in relation to nature and development would play. Now, IUCN's strength comes from the fact that we are a union, meaning we include, for example, over 90 state members around the world, hundreds of NGOs, civil societies, and this is the diversity that we bring to our organization. When you talk about these different program themes that you see here, this is actually done by about 18,000 experts that we have around the world serving in our different global science commissions. Here in Southeast Asia, most of the countries are state members of the IUCN, except the Philippines, unfortunately, I have to say, my own home country. Okay, now within this background, let me take you now to just 5 key points as I started wondering about what change leadership means for agriculture and nature and the environment with all the challenges we're facing today, from climate to COVID. One of the most important points I realized is when we talk about change leadership, we often associate it with leaders changing organizations and systems and the world. Often what we miss to realize is that organizations and systems in the world change even if leaders don't. In other words, with the nature of the leadership that is provided to the world and to countries and to organizations, even to our own communities, is not a direct influence, a conscious influence on how the external world around us is changing. Let's have an example. Many years ago, when I was still a student, it was when I was introduced to the challenge of productivity in agriculture. We talk about the Green Revolution and the post-Green Revolution. I started my career at a time when the buzzword was sustainability. And so it was no longer enough to produce, but we must produce it while being able to manage natural resources sustainably. Today, the key word we hear is resilience. Now, it's not that we are forgetting productivity or sustainability. We are just adding layers and we are adding new challenges to what was before. In other words, the agriculture world, the environment world, the natural world keeps changing. And it is for us as leaders, for you as leaders, to be able to adapt, to manage, and to keep pace with this changing environment. In other words, change leadership is not really an option. It is an essential because, as I said, organizations and the world change even if leaders don't. But that's not the point. What we wanted to do today is to emphasize the need for leaders to change just as organizations and their external world are changing. I'm also reminded of another example years ago. We heard a lot, maybe 20 years ago, about women in development and all the feminist approaches that go with it. Much later on, we hear not only about women, but we started talking about gender, the importance of men and women together. Today, it even goes beyond that. We no longer look at gender as the only social variable that's important. We talk about social inclusion, referring to gender and age and ethnicity, physical disability. So again, it's an example of how the external world is changing and how leaders need to change in order to keep pace with the systems and organizations that they are supposed to be leading the change for. Now, the second point is, since change leadership is about leaders having to change, it's also important for us to realize that leaders can only change if leaders learn to change. Because navigating change will always be a leader's constant work in progress. I was reflecting on my own career path, for example, so which could be divided my almost 20 years in the CJER. Then I went to the ILO, and then now I'm with IUCN. All throughout, I was working in the area of sustainable livelihoods, and primarily around inclusive business and inclusive markets and value chains. It has been consistent all throughout, but what I have learned through the whole journey, in the CJER, we talk about primarily of yield and income as the key metrics of successful programs and organizations working on markets and value chains for the poor. So all our analysis, all our project designs seek to address indicators and targets relating to yield and income. When I moved to the ILO, I was still working around small and medium enterprises, but we had a different lens. I was called upon to look at not just yield, income, and profit, but true to our mandate as the International Labor Organization, it's about ensuring better workers and workplaces, looking at occupational health and safety, looking at COVID rapid response to pandemic displaced workers. So it's a very different lens, but it's an add-on to what I had before. And it still is the same world, and it's still the same domain. Right now in the IUCN, I'm not forgetting what I learned the CGR or the ILO, but on top of that, we now talk about nature positive food systems, nature-based solutions. What I'm saying is, as we go through life and the challenges of a leader, as we move from one work to another, we don't stop learning. And what we do is we simply add on. It enhances and enriches our perspective. And I think that is important. We talk about change leadership, that leaders need to learn in order to change themselves and to change the organization that they are responsible for. Oftentimes, when we talk about change leadership, we talk about a leader as an external driver, driving influence change of an organization, of a country, of the world. We often forget that leaders cannot just be drivers. They are the change themselves. There has been a shift, for example, in the thinking of how we approach development in the world. Many of us come from a science background, and we're always told that to do science excellence, we need to be objective. And that's how, as leaders, we need to be objective in the world. But we know that development cannot be detached from the human and the social dimensions. And so there is always that subjective, put in quotation marks, dimension to it. But in reality, what we really consider as objective and scientific objectivity comes from what's called intersubjective. In other words, we as human beings, scientists who are people, agree on something as being factual or being objective. So more and more, we're really moving away from just the simplistic notion of objective as an indicator of excellence to intersubjective, coming to agreement, to consensus, and to seeking common ground. The same when we speak about systems. Many years ago, when I was at university, we had a much simpler idea of systems. You produce something, you deliver it, and you consume, or you talk about a farming system. As we realize the interconnectedness of people among themselves and between people and the natural environment, then we reframe our notion of systems from simple to complicated and to complex. And many times I hear people interchangeably use complicated and complex, and we know they're not the same, right? Complicated is what you use to define a relationship or a system that has many different levels of difficulties. It is difficult, but it is solvable because the solutions exist. We refer to systems or relationships as complex when it has multiple components and there are many unknowns and there are no obvious solutions available. So going back to change, it's much the same thing. Some of the changes are simple, some are complicated, they're difficult, but they are solvable. We know what the solutions are. But then there are changes which are totally complex. And going back to change leadership, what is important is to distinguish what is the nature of change that we seek to change. But more importantly, that we are part of it. I remember now in the IUCN, we talk about conservation of nature. We talked about how we want to change the world by valuing nature and its contribution to development. That is our organizational mandate. Now, how do we translate that in terms of change leadership and organizational change? If we have to walk the talk, I have to make sure in our office, I'm right here in Bangkok, that our own office complex here represents and displays and demonstrates the key values and goals that we seek, meaning having green infrastructure, making sure that we manage waste inside the office, but even at a more personal level. So now, more than ever, I'm more conscious, for example, in avoiding plastic bags, because how can be a spokesperson for IUCN going around these different countries if I myself am not making sure that I represent the change of my organization? So organizations change for, with, by, and those who lead them. And that every leader should be aware of. Another point that's important for us as leaders is while we talk about change leadership, we succeed so well that at some point, there's one change that we want to avoid, and that we as leaders being changed. Now, it's important that leaders need to know when to move on, when to let go, and when to hand over. Because there's no such thing as forever in leadership and many aspects in life. What does that mean? It means that as leaders in agriculture and the wider world, we need to be proactive in talent acquisition and retention. I'm glad SEARCA is organizing this event because a lot of what it does, in fact, supports the idea of succession planning and mentoring and coaching. The many in the audience today who represent the next generation. We, the speakers today, we will grow old and we're going to retire one day. And we need to nurture the next generation who will carry on, because leadership, even change leadership, is never forever. So even in retirement, I mean, it's interesting that I've taken on leadership roles, I think almost all of them, where my predecessors left because they had to retire. And I can say that the most difficult part of letting go and moving on and handing over is when you don't have good retirement plans. And so I think for all of us nearing retirement, it's very important that 10 years, 15 years ahead, we should already start to plan what we want to do ahead, because it's important to enable and to open opportunities to the next generation. So as we lead the change, we must also change the lead at some point. And more importantly, change leaders are people. They're not just professionals. They're not just experts. And we do need to realize that there's more to life than working as change leaders. We have seen the impact of COVID and how it's changed the value system of people and organizations. The pressure on us not to lose our jobs, the pressure on us to be creative and to do improvisation in continuing to work under difficult circumstances, when we can no longer travel, we can no longer be in the office every day. This is making people reflect on what is important in life, and that change leadership also is as much about balancing the rest of your lives, of our lives as individuals. Now, people talk about life-work balance all the time, but I think a good example is what I found in our ILO data set. Even before COVID, and this I want to share with you, around the world, this shows the percentage of workers who are home-based. So this was even pre-COVID, when we were already talking about teleworking and working from home, and also starting your own livelihoods at home. What is interesting in this picture globally is you look at Southeast Asia. It's actually one of the regions with the relatively higher percentage of workers already working from home. I would have expected that in the North and in the West. Now, imagine This is 2019 data, what it's gonna be like today and with COVID and how these percentages go up. What's interesting is to look at, okay, who are these people who are working from home, not in traditional office environments? About 20% are basically employees. They have full-time jobs in offices, but are working from home, are allowed to be teleworking. It will be interesting to run the same surveys today and see whether the 20% of 2 years ago could be a lot more these days. But what we're saying is under this new working environment, there will be a change in leadership itself and the way we think about change leadership, because we're no longer thinking about a team that works together, sits around the table. Many of these are going to be virtual and are virtual. We will no longer be able to shake hands. We'll no longer be able to sit around the table and share a meal because of restrictions for COVID into the future. But what's important is it makes us reassess what's most important in life. Is it our job and our work as leaders, officially, professionally, but also the safety, security, well-being of our own selves, our families, and our communities. Finally, I cannot end the presentation without referring to a very important change. As you may have heard, last week, the world launched the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration. This is a very important decade. This is when we address in the next 10 years the importance of habitat for wildlife, soils and watershed protection, healthy urban ecologies, and changing climates. FAO, UN Environment, and IUCN formed a consortium that is taking charge in the implementation of the activities for this decade, and particularly for us at IUCN, providing the scientific base to provide the tools, decision support tools, and the knowledge product that will enable of us to achieve the goals of ecosystem restoration in 2030. Having said that, it is important for all of us and for you, current and future professionals, to recognize that in the next 10 years, there's a lot of opportunities, career-wise, even in your own personal lives, to contribute towards ecosystem restoration as a global agenda for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Campilan, for sharing your insights on leadership and initiating change. Thank you as well for highlighting the UN Decade on Ecosystems Restoration and calling on for participation on this. One of the things I noted is that the idea of succession leadership is important, which I deem is also very necessary, especially in ensuring sustainability in agriculture and rural development. Transformational leadership is indeed about creating leaders as well. Again, may I remind our online attendees watching the webinar via Facebook Live, please start typing in your questions in the comments section, including your location or country of origin. If you're tuned in via Zoom, please post your questions in the Q&A box, which you will find in the menu bar on your screen. I saw someone raise his hand earlier. You can also do this, and then we will acknowledge you later during the open forum. Kindly refrain from posting your email addresses in the comments section. You can provide this information to us upon responding to our evaluation form and e-certificate request, which will be shared at the end of the webinar. While waiting for the next presentation to be shared on the screen, please allow me to tell you more about our final speaker. Ms. Jade Dyson is the Director of the Grain and Feed Trade Association, or GAFTA, Southeast Asia Pacific region, and she's also the current president of WOMAG, a volunteer-led industry organization working to accelerate the development of female leaders in the food and agriculture ecosystem in Southeast Asia by providing opportunities for networking, knowledge building, and professional development. Ms. Dyson previously held positions in both operations and trading at CBH Grain in Western Australia before relocating to Singapore with GAFTA to support and develop international grain trade in the region. GAFTA's advocacy for international trade and free market access, combined with Ms. Jade's passion for industry progression, particularly in the diversity and inclusion space, continues to drive her work in the region and has seen her co-found a number of industry initiatives. Without further ado, let us all welcome Ms. Jade Dyson.
Thank you to Dennis and Dindo for your presentations. I think they lead quite well into what I'm going to talk about today. So what I'm going to do is look quite specifically at WOMAG. Oh, that's great. I've made a typo on my opening screen. Fantastic. And the work that I've been doing there over the past few years, and how that fits in with the transformation leadership model. So a little bit about me. I am a big believer in work-life balance, flexible working, being treated and treating others as individuals. And for me, that means making time for my personal goals, such as swimming the English Channel, making time for my family. And right now that specifically means I'm working from home with my 4-month-old, who you can see there on the screen. And COVID has certainly meant that more and more people are now understanding how work-life balance affects us in the workplace. And I definitely feel like I am labelled less of a typical millennial now than I was 18 months ago for advocating for those sorts of things. So today I'm going to focus on my experience with WOMAG, and transformational leadership as a concept directly aligns to how I've been leading the organisation, or doing my best to lead the organisation over the last 3 years, centred around the idea that I can, alongside our team, develop a long-term vision and strategy, identify the challenges of achieving our mission, then setting up tools, framework and funding to deal with these challenges and achieve our goals, and inspire the people around me to make it happen in a way that is also of benefit to them, especially given we are all, everyone involved in WOMAG is a volunteer, and we all have full-time day jobs at the same time. So WOMAG was founded in 2016, and it's a women-led and volunteer-led association of professional men and women promoting gender diversity in the food and agribusiness ecosystem in Asia. We aspire to develop future leaders that are equipped to address the industry's challenges and foster diversity in the workplace by organising regular professional development opportunities, networking events, industry events, and forming meaningful partnerships. And when WOMAG started 5 or 6 years ago, it was very organic. It was a handful of women, and we funded our mission purely through individual memberships, and we ran things on an event by event basis. And we built absolutely everything from the ground up, opening a registered company, creating a website, planning events, managing community and outreach, onboarding volunteers. And as the organisation grew, of course, we started to face different challenges. And some of those challenges included there being a handful of people, myself included, who for many years was spending an unsustainable amount of time on WOMAG. And what that also meant was that WOMAG became reliant on those people as opposed to the structure of the organisation as a whole. And if any one person were to suddenly leave the organisation, there would be a huge gap left behind and an impossible workload on the remaining volunteers. Another issue in following on from that was volunteer burnout was a real problem. You know, we started with such a strong core group of people who were so driven and motivated about this idea that we were taking forward that we all really jumped in the deep end. But what we realised was that we really needed to address the workload to make volunteer opportunities more attractive to more people, and therefore more inclusive. And as the core group of people left, what it meant was we had new volunteers coming in who needed a higher level of management because they hadn't been involved from the start, and in some cases, different levels of motivation. We also recognised that we needed to stop running on an event-by-event basis, or we risked losing our alignment with our original goals and mission. And a lack of direction trickles down from the top through the entire team. We also recognised that if we were to expand and grow our organisation in size, that both the community represent and our volunteers, then we needed a clearly defined mission, value, organisational structure, governance processes, and strategic plan going forward. And we were very quickly outgrowing the structure that had at one point been working for us. And we needed to access additional funding in order to enable us to really drive our agenda forward and make our services as accessible as possible. And unlike a typical workplace, we didn't have access to a huge number of specialist people to handle different operational requirements. We were a small team, often working on things that were very different to our day job. And what this ultimately led me to was a decision that we needed to do two things when I took over as president 3 years ago. One was to undertake a strategic overhaul to address these issues and ensure WOMAG's viable sustainability. And the other thing that I needed to do was create space to allow that to happen. And this meant that I had to make a difficult decision that in 2019, we were going to run less events. And we were going to do that to allow our volunteers to recover from their burnout, hopefully reinvigorate their motivation for why they're involved, and allow us to retain them as volunteers, and also to free up their time to be part of this strategic process that we eventually started in 2020, just as COVID hit. So the process that we kind of went through was that we needed to identify that there was a need for transformation. And I think often the idea of transformation in relation to leadership is an absolute ongoing journey, and it's how you approach management and leadership in general. But in this particular case, there was a very real need for a very defined transformation project to ensure a strong and sustainable organisation that would thrive and adapt as it grew, and would leave behind a really strong succession plan for as individuals left the organisation. And at this point, we also identified that we needed outside help. We needed to bring in a consultant to help us work through this in a really efficient and effective way. So one of the things that we did a lot is we workshopped. We workshopped internally, we workshopped externally, we looked at all the positives, the things that had been working really well and the things that hadn't been working well. And we wanted to engage as many people in that process as possible. So it meant that we went out to our community and we took a lot of feedback. We did it both through surveys and kind of broad outreach, and we also targeted people through individual and small groups in a small group setting. And then from there, we created smaller substreams or work streams to dive deeper into these various areas. And this allowed us to engage the entire volunteer network and the community and empower as many people as possible to be part of the transformation in an efficient and effective way. And once we identified those areas, we then rolled them together and made sure that there was cross collaboration between the different areas. And these recommendations heavily influence the new organisational governance structure that we put in place. And this was really key to how we managed our volunteers and individuals, and how we made sure they were feeling empowered and getting the best out of their volunteering experience with us. And in turn, our community was getting the most out of the work that our volunteers were doing. We then, of course, implemented these recommendations along with a feedback loop that allowed us to continuously review them, both internally and externally, and set up a process for what that would look like in the future. So I was asked today to share some personal lessons from my time at WOMAG. And looking back, I think I probably had already adopted a little bit of a transformational leadership style before I even possibly really understood the specifics of that terminology. And a transformational leader is something that I certainly aspire to, particularly in the volunteer space. And a transformational leader encourages rather than commands, and he or she inspires and motivates rather than instructs, and leads by example rather than direction. And I believe this leadership style is really necessary in a volunteer-led organisation, because as leaders, we want to encourage the motivation and positive development of our volunteers and our community. We want to exemplify moral standards within the organisation and encourage the same of others. We want to foster an ethical work environment with clear values, priorities, and standards. We want to build a company culture or an organisational culture by encouraging volunteers to adopt a mindset where they are working for the common good. We want to hold an emphasis on authenticity, cooperation, and open communication, and provide support and mentoring, but at the same time, allowing volunteers to make decisions and take ownership of their tasks. And I think one thing became apparent very quickly, and that was how different volunteer-led organisations are to traditional paid employment. I had never been involved in a not-for-profit or a volunteer-led organisation before I became involved in WOMAG, and really quickly I identified that we needed to create a culture that allowed our volunteers to have clearly defined tasks that could be achieved reasonably within their capabilities and time limitations, but also while retaining an element of flexibility to allow the organisation to benefit from the range of individuals working with us and without placing people in really rigid boxes. And we wanted the vision of our volunteers to contribute to our growth. And it also allowed for clear communication of expectations in both directions, which is really, really key. I think one of the things that we recognised and learnt, or that I have always sort of has been one of my high priorities, is investing time in recruitment and the ongoing engagement of our team. WOMAG would absolutely not exist without the incredible team working behind the scenes to make it happen. And I would not have been successful in my leadership role at WOMAG if I didn't have such a fantastic team working directly with me at a managerial level. And I identified really key people to bring into the organisation, and they have really had a direct impact on its success. And they've also allowed me to achieve my goals at WOMAG without having to continuously subject myself to trying to spend 20 hours a week on top of my day job. And, mentorship, I think, is something that's really, really key at any level of your career, both providing mentorship and receiving mentorship. And the two-way model of mentorship works really, really well. And it's not even something that has to be in a formal or official capacity. But when we talk about building leadership, and when we talk about building women-specific leadership in an industry that is can be, particularly in the corporate side of agribusiness, it's very, very male-dominated. Women are not, we don't see women representation at the leadership level, not to the level we would like to see it. And when there are women at those leadership levels, often they're not as visible as they probably should be. And mentorship is, it's a really big part of that. It's a really big part of, building the skills that you need to step up into those leadership roles. I think self-awareness and self-reflection are absolutely key attributes of anyone aspiring to be a leader. It's something I take very, very seriously, and especially in the not-for-profit space, we always need to be reevaluating our motives behind our decisions. Are we acting in the best interest of the people we serve? Is my voice the voice that needs to be heard, or is it the voice of the people that we're trying to represent? As a leader, is my voice being too loud? Do I need to make sure that the volunteers working in our organisation feel comfortable and confident in speaking up, and feeling like they have, in the appropriate times, an equal voice? I think as well, something that I've learnt, particularly working in Asia, I came from a trading background, which meant that I worked with all men in a very kind of cutthroat environment, a very, very fast-paced environment. There was not a lot of time for formalities, not a huge emphasis put on external kind of communication. And coming into Asia and working with different people and different cultures, I really had to evaluate the way that I communicated, evaluate the leadership styles that would or wouldn't work in this area. And I think adjusting your approach to both culture, environment, and the individuals is key. Our organisation specifically is the organisational success is the sum total of our people. So it's really important to keep that in mind. And I think as well, making sure that we're always leading by example, because if you, for example, openly say you support flexible working hours and then you spend 12 hours a day at your desk in the office, your actions don't match your words. And your team or those working around you will deem your behaviour to be an expectation that you have on them. So I think that's something that's really been at the forefront of, you know, anyone in management positions kind of minds over the last, particularly over the COVID period. I think leadership styles are often a blend of many different labelled styles, but in the case of WOMAG, having a transformational leadership approach has definitely allowed the organisation and its volunteers to flourish to achieve our goals of helping to nurture and grow the future women leaders of the agribusiness industry. So thank you very much for Dennis and Dindo for your presentations. I'm looking forward to reviewing them again and seeing what elements of that we can work into our organisation.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Dyson, for sharing with us a snapshot of WOMAG and your journey in establishing this volunteer-led organization. It was very interesting to learn about how you have decided to address the problems and challenges you face, especially on managing volunteers. I think you were able to highlight how you have expressed an adaptive capacity, which is crucial in being a transformational leader. With that, let us now move on to the open forum. We have several questions lined up. The question is for Dr. Dennis Garrity. How does the Evergreening campaign work with governments? What are some concrete initiatives taken for this?
Oh, thank you for that question. How does the Alliance work with governments? Well, in the context of working on large-scale restoration programs within specific countries, our key intervention is influencing the policy environment that supports restoration, supports carbon capture in the landscape, supports agricultural investments that improve the resilience of farmers while also improving the mitigation of carbon in the soil and in the landscape as a whole with agroforestry. So I would say that policy influencing is the key aspect, and of course a linkage with government in supporting the operations of land restoration as well. And that involves investment in linking extension systems, linking government-funded, government-budgeted projects, etc. So these are some of the aspects that I think are important.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Garrity. Our next question is from Karen Bautista for Dr. Campilan. In terms of local governance, may I ask how will we ensure transformative and successional leadership in agriculture if the leaders of the Department of Agriculture and other departments in the Philippines are presidential appointees? The assistant directors and bureau directors, assistant secretaries, undersecretaries, and the department secretary do not have a security of tenure, and they will change after 6 years or sometimes shorter if the president is not satisfied with their performance. Program planning and implementation changes when there is a new leader in DA, leaving behind the programs of the previous administration.
Thank you, Karen, for the question. Wow, those questions sound like what you would ask in a presidential debate for the next election. I have to admit that I don't know much about Philippine bureaucracy now. I've been away for a while, but this I can say, and comparing it with other countries, I think the problem you've cited isn't just about change leadership or transformative and successional leadership, as you said. It's about the system and not just the leader. So as leaders, it's important to realize what are our spheres of influence, right? There's a lot that we can do as leaders within that influence and control sphere that we have, but there are certain challenges and obstacles, if you might say, that belong to the wider system and the organization. So I think as a leader, what you need to do is to highlight and to underscore these bigger problems and issues that go beyond your own leadership control and influence sphere. I have worked, and I have many good friends at the Department of Agriculture, past and present. I can see that many of them as individuals have truly been performing very well and dedicated. But it's not just the DA, it's many departments. It's not just the Philippines. I mean, I can tell you what it's like in the other countries. So in short, I think it's about looking at the synergy between the transformation that is required of you as a leader and the transformation that is required of the broader organization of which you are only a part of. But I think on a more personal note, what is also important, again, is looking at your own goals and your own visions of your own career and your profession, whether your own goals fit, diverge, converge with those of the larger organization. And I think you can only be truly productive and successful and professionally satisfied if those goals converge. But if they diverge, it's an important critical point for you to make a decision. I think my short advice is whether to stay on or to leave, it's up to you, but it's always important to remember that you choose those who choose you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Campilan. Our next question is for Ms. Jade Dyson. Thank you for sharing the challenges of leading a volunteer-led organization. What was your strategy in getting in volunteers and expanding WOMAG?
Thanks. I think the first thing that we had to address was how we manage the volunteer experience, because it's a bit of a fine balance between you want to allow volunteers to have flexibility because of course they're volunteering their time, but at the same time people need to understand what's expected of them and what they can expect from the organisation in return. So step one of the volunteer experience was setting that up correctly internally, and that included the entire organisational structure and reporting lines, how we were dividing work and all those sorts of things. And you have to remember that managing people also takes time. So there's this kind of balance of, you don't want the organisation to be so large that without spending money on operational systems of how we're all going to communicate and work together, you don't want that to create a hindrance, but at the same time, you need enough people that no one person is having to do too much from a workload perspective. So that was step number one. Also, one of the things that we really looked at as part of our strategy project was we had a really, really deep internal look at our diversity and inclusion strategy. And one thing that we identified is that and this all came out of good intentions, but it doesn't necessarily make it correct. We were essentially a team of expats living in Singapore and pushing the agenda, and we had a really that we were lacking local representation. So one of the things that we're doing at the moment is really looking at taking feedback from our local community of how we can attract more local representation to the organisation. And we're setting diversity and inclusion targets internally and making sure that we have a really, really, really good succession planning. And so things like making sure that we have set terms, that we have that turnover of staff, not so frequently that it's disrupted, but enough that we still are making way for diversity to come through. And that's part of the reason why at the end of this year, I'll be stepping down to allow for someone else to come in and bring fresh ideas and new ideas. And one of the things I'm working at the moment is just making sure that the organisation is set up in a really sustainable way so that not only when I leave will there be no gap left behind, but the organisation's in a place to be taken to even greater heights with a new person leading the organisation. So from the volunteer side, I hope that covers your questions. From a WOMAG growth side, at the moment what we're doing is looking at how we can expand regionally. So one of the great things about COVID was a lot of our offering and a lot of our events had to go online. And that's something that we will retain irrespective of what happens going forward with COVID. Some of our events will resume face-to-face in person in Singapore, but the plan is to keep a reasonable amount of our events online so that they can be accessible or accessed by people in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Australia, in India, in Myanmar, all of those places. And eventually we hope that we can actually have an in-person presence in all of those countries as well. But it is a process because we only have so much manpower and so many funds. So what we plan to do is keep pushing the 3 pillars, which is professional development, industry events to allow people to broaden their understanding beyond just their particular role. I think Dennis's presentation did a really good job of giving us an overview, particularly of what we're working towards in terms of sustainability. And irrespective of what your actual desk job is or what your day job is, it's really important to understand that bigger picture. So part of our industry events is really addressing that and trying to give people the opportunity to kind of broaden their knowledge. And then the professional development piece is specifically about how we can upskill women to be able to take those leadership positions. And then the networking piece that comes along with that is making sure that women have the connections to form mentorship relationships or to become aware of opportunities that present themselves. So I can certainly provide, a lot more information if anyone's interested in information on WOMAG or getting involved as a volunteer. Certainly feel free to reach out.
Okay, Ms. Jade, there is a follow-up question here since you're in the topic of volunteers. It's from Ms. Teresa Vano from Alberta, Canada. How do you retain and motivate your volunteers? In your selection process for volunteers, what skill sets are you exactly looking for?
So I think, there is an element of self-motivation that people come to the organisation with. I think when you sign up for a volunteer role, you're obviously already at the understanding level that you're volunteering your time. I think a lot of the motivation comes from people feeling empowered to be part of change and to really contribute to the organisation. So when volunteers come on board, they come on board for perhaps a specific role, but at the same time, they come on board as contributing to our bigger mission and solving, a bigger problem. So I think what's really key to volunteer engagement is really making sure they have an opportunity to be a part of that and are coming on board to do something more than just sending an email or writing a communication or developing marketing for a particular event. People are, our volunteers are encouraged to move around positions and to be involved in developing the content for an event, for coming up with ideas of what we should be talking about, for making sure that the right voices are being heard. When it comes to the skills that we're looking for, it depends on the role itself. We have a range of roles available from content creation, from events, from partnerships, managing our membership base, or looking at our diversity and inclusion aspect and making sure that there is a D&I test applied to absolutely everything that we can do. We are still a very new organisation. There are 100 things that we could do better. We strive to lead by example, particularly on the diversity and inclusion front, but there are always ways that we can better that. So yeah, our volunteers bring a range of different skill sets, to be honest. And I would like to think that no matter what a skill set someone is putting their hand up to offer to WOMAG, that we can find a way to work that into our organisation.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Jade. Our next question is for Dr. Garrity. It is again from Karen Bautista. How will the Evergreening Alliance contribute to the land degradation neutrality target in line with the Sustainable Development Goal 15.3?
Great. Well, the land degradation neutrality targets are being developed by about 120 countries around the world, and they embody the country's commitment to both the preservation or protection of non-degraded land, as well as restoring degraded land. And as I discussed in the presentation, the Alliance is mobilizing with countries to be able to implement very large-scale restoration activities through the membership, the partnerships with the many international, national, and local grassroots organizations that you find working in each of the countries. And so that effort, which is embodying a large-scale, unified mission of land restoration, fits right into the land degradation neutrality mission and objectives, actually.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dennis. Our next question is from Ms. Maria Celeste Habito Cadiz, and it's for Sir Dindo and Ms. Jade. The question is, from your experience-based insights, can you share some thoughts on how we can best develop our next leaders through the educational system? Let's start with Sir Dindo.
You asked about how we develop the next generation of leaders. I think it's two ways. One is before we develop the next generation, let's develop the current generation. And by that, I mean developing the current generation of leaders' capacity to nurture, to lead the way, and as what I said earlier, to let go and to hand over. For as long as the current generation of leaders are not willing to do that, there will be very limited opportunities for the young and the new and the inexperienced to move on and to go up. So that, I think, is the first challenge when it's, say, developing leaders. Let's look at ourselves, the current leaders, and be able to welcome and to provide the opportunities. On the next generation of leaders, there are many ways to do it, but I think it's always important to go back to learning. The learning has to be continuous. Even if you get your PhD and your MS or SEARCA scholarship in UPLB, it doesn't stop there. I think one of my greatest mistakes was in assuming that getting a PhD was the end game. And when I realized it's just a license to even learn further. Looking back, for example, I mean, I just started working on potatoes and root and tubers, cassava and climate change. And what do I do now? I mean, I'm working a portfolio that covers conservation of tigers and elephants and vultures, human-animal interaction. I don't remember I had a course on that before, but what is important is the openness and the willingness to learn, because as I said, the world will continuously change anyway. What we learned from textbooks 5 years earlier or in courses 10 years earlier will no longer be the same today. So it's not about the content, I think, it's the attitude and about the skill set to continue learning, because your career pathways and the organizations will continue to evolve and to face new challenges and directions in the future. So learning probably is the key, continuous learning.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dindo. Ms. Jade?
Yeah, really, really excellent points. And I think I'm someone who's very fortunate that there are some, you know, people who I would consider senior leaders who are investing time in helping me develop my skills as I, you know, move through my career. On the educational front, I mean, the reasons why we don't see as many, if we look at it from a female leadership standpoint, which is what WOMAG kind of focuses on, the reasons why we don't see women in those leadership roles are for a different reason, different reasons depending on what part of the ecosystem we're looking at. So of course, the challenges that women or people in general in rural areas and smallholder farmers face are different to those in the corporate sector. And I think you know, education, there's definitely the formal side of education, and then there's the informal side of education. And a lot of education comes through putting yourself out there to get the experience. And that's, you know, another reason why we want to make as many volunteer opportunities available as possible, because that's a way that people can get experience, and that's a way that people can broaden their knowledge and their understanding. And we provide some very tangible education opportunities that isn't going and getting an MBA or a PhD, because those are absolutely fantastic goals, but they are not necessarily goals that are attainable to everyone depending on your financial situation or where you're located. So as an example, a really key skill to have is communication skills. And so one of the training programs that we're running at WOMAG is a keynote speaking training program. And it's something that's I'm really passionate about, because whether or not keynote speaking is your end goal, the idea that you can bring your ideas together and you can present those ideas and sell those ideas to other people is really, really key, even for internal stakeholder meetings, external stakeholder meetings, or if you're speaking to, you know, a conference of 1,000 people, the skills are all transferable. And we're talking about, you know, something that costs a small amount of money and is a 6-month program, you know, is something that may be more accessible to more people than going and doing an MBA, and both have their places, right? But something WOMAG looks at is how we can really make a difference on the educational front in sort of small ways, but ways that kind of produce really immediate results for people that they can work into their kind of everyday employment to kind of help keep developing themselves over time. Because as Dindo said, it's a continuum of change and of growth. It's not like you just, you go and do that MBA and all of a sudden you're qualified as a manager or a leader. It doesn't really quite work like that. It's all about, continuous skill development. And yes, you can go and learn theories and strategies and all sorts of things, but at the end of the day, you need to be able to come back and apply them to a range of situations and organizations and cultures and challenges.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Jade. Our next question is for the budding young leaders related to that. How will you open avenues for the youth to contribute to transformational leadership? What will be your concrete plan for these contributions to be more sustainable? And this goes out to all our speakers. Let's start with Dr. Dennis.
Well, concrete plans is a little more than we can really talk about today, but I think that each of our organizations and our networks need to internalize all of the principles that particularly Dindo and Jade have expressed so eloquently, and to ensure that this leadership transition is accelerated. As I tried to emphasize, we're facing a global challenge that is above and beyond anything that we have experienced in the past, but it can take lessons from those experiences. We need to actually ramp up on a war footing in order to have any chance of succeeding in avoiding a climate catastrophe. And so we've got to take very, very seriously the immense importance of nurturing a whole new generation of young leaders to take on this role. After all, they will be the ones experiencing the suffering that humanity will be having in future decades to a great degree, and they will have the motivation to actually look creatively at how we can go about solving these problems. So I believe that the climate emergency is a vast and extremely important challenge for, or opportunity for, the development of that class of young, motivated, and extremely concerned leaders.
Thank you, Dr. Dennis. Dr. Dindo?
I think it's 3 points here. The first one is not about what our plans are, but also what the young generation, the young people want to do and what their plans are. And that's where we start. Because a lot of young people, we know the interns and the students come to us, they seem to forget that the current breed of leaders now come from somewhere before. In other words, we also started before, and it's not just the now. And I say that because many young people think, oh, I want to work for the UN. Oh, I want to have an international career. But remember, you have to start from somewhere. And oftentimes that can just be a very simple and junior position. It's even unpaid. So I think it's about first gaining your experience and polishing your skills. And it's not going to be overnight. And Jade said that, you got an MBA, you don't become a manager or a CEO overnight. You have to start from somewhere for that. Now, on our side, what can we do? I'm speaking of IUCN. We realize the importance of the youth, but not only the youth, but the marginalized sectors in our work. But speaking of younger professionals, so we just had a global youth congress on conservation about 2 months ago. It's about 3,000 plus speakers. So these are the champions who go forward and help us achieve these big goals we speak of, the SDGs and the UN Decade Ecosystem Restoration. In terms of specific opportunities, one way is first to entice and to interest the young to enter agriculture and careers in agriculture, whether in science or in business or in development. A lot has been said about making agriculture sexy, and that's right. But I think we need to go past these buzzwords. It's about, for example, how do we provide internship that just doesn't talk about field data collection, but talking about big data, future scenario building and modeling. We talk about business for biodiversity and not just agribusiness. So I think our nature entrepreneurship. So that's how we, at least in my program now in Asia and Oceania, we first think about how do we package this so that the young can relate to these broader goals while also connected to their interests, whether in the digital revolution or in some other sectors or disciplines. So I think it takes both sides to work on this. But the important thing is for the young to open up and learn and remember that it's a long journey. It doesn't happen overnight.
Thank you, Dr. Dindo. Ms. Jade?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dennis and Dindo, covered it perfectly. From perhaps the perspective of someone kind of young in their career and whatnot, I look back at my first few jobs, and I think at the time it was a lot of, grunt work, but it was the absolute best roles I could have possibly started in, because it gave me such an understanding of how, my particular part of agribusiness worked from the ground up. Before moving to Singapore and taking on a kind of regional lead role, I was working in the trading team, but prior to working in the trading team, I worked in the operational team. And prior to working in the operational team, my job was to answer the phone calls of farmers, and I had to learn to answer all of the tiny little questions, well, they're not tiny questions, massive questions for them, but such small detail questions. And that's I was very actually fortunate that was my first job, because it meant I got to kind of move through the organization that I was in from the ground up. And it just meant that I was fortunate that I had really great foundations or building blocks to kind of build up on. And I've also been lucky that throughout my career so far, I've got to work with some fantastic leaders or senior people in the industry who haven't had egos get in the way of involving someone like myself at the table or in conversations. I think there is such an element of, different seniority levels kind of working together, because I certainly do not have the experience that Dennis and Dindo have, for example. I wouldn't even come close, but there may be insights that I have that still mean I have a voice that deserves a seat at the table. So, and I think, as a young person, you just need to kind of really think about your career path and taking what steps you can take to kind of develop yourself. And, for me, that was at one point getting involved in WOMAG. And if I'm being completely honest, as much as the amazing work that I feel like WOMAG's done and the things we've achieved, it's also really benefited me on a personal level. I've really grown and developed through my experience with WOMAG, and it's an opportunity that I'm really grateful to have had. And I think I will definitely look back and it will be a really fundamental part of my career.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Jade. We have a few more questions lined up. Our next question is for you again, Ms. Jade, actually. Can you tell us about how you foster partnerships, like your initiative with Grow Her? What is your strategy in giving smallholder farmers voice through your platform?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to our partnerships, one thing we don't want to do is reinvent the wheel, right? We don't want to compete with other organizations that are already set up to achieve or tackle really specific problems. And being based in Singapore, I don't personally understand and live the challenges that smallholder farmers live. So one partnership that we have is an initiative called Grow Her, and Grow Her is actually already a kind of joint partnership, and it's designed to connect women, sort of agripreneurs, to share information, to share resources, to share their stories, and give those women a platform and for their voices to be heard. So WOMAG in Singapore doesn't directly represent smallholder farmers, but we recognise that they are a fundamental part of the ecosystem. So that's why we've partnered with Grow Her to do what we can, given our skill set and our offering in Singapore, to support that platform with what they're trying to do with giving smallholder farmers a voice. So that's kind of where that fits in. And we do the same with we sort of follow the same thing with other partnerships. When we look at this Keynote Women Speakers program, for example, instead of, we don't have the expertise in-house, and instead of trying to hire those expertise in and then replicate what another company is already doing, it made much more sense to partner with the Keynote Women's Directory and leverage off their skill set to tailor something and offer that back to our community. So that's kind of how we view our partnerships. They're generally they're not always a two-way relationship. Sometimes it's more of us. What can we do? We're in a position to be able to support and to help. What can we do? But yeah, I think that's probably the way that we tend to approach our partnerships.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Jade. I think we have one last question for today. It's for Dr. Campilan. It was mentioned that you had some experience in COVID-19 response. Can you tell us more about your experience in Myanmar? How did your leadership role play out in that experience? As we understand, there is no handbook in managing a pandemic and its socio-economic effects.
The work I did in Myanmar for ILO was supposedly going to focus on small, medium enterprise development in ecotourism, agriculture, and manufacturing, looking at improving workplace safety, say in factories, so there's a garment sector, certifying local community tourist guides. So that was a starting point. And then COVID came, and that changed the whole ball game, because then many of these sectors basically lost their sources of income. There were no more tourists. The orders from companies in other parts of the world were canceled. So we had to look at many different options. So one way, one is to help the government develop standards for COVID safety for workplaces and workers. In other words, what are the guidelines on occupational safe and healthy when a factory can open or can close? And that's not really very easy, because we didn't know enough of the COVID pandemic, right? But I think the two other more important aspects of the work I did with ILO in Myanmar, one was on displaced workers, and especially migrant workers coming from Thailand or from the Middle East. These are formerly people from the rural areas who went to the Middle East and Thailand to become construction workers, and now are coming back to the country because they lost their jobs, and they have to rebuild their agricultural livelihoods. That calls for a retraining and retooling of former migrant workers now back into their home. The third area that we're working at is about disrupted food supply chains. And we're talking about domestic supply chains and international, when we can no longer transport goods from one place to the other, right? When there are risks involved when you are handling food and giving it from one person or the other. So we had to ensure that those supply chains, at least in the food sector, are repurposed, are also adapted so that they can continue to function, and there will be food in the cities, even if there's limited transport. So that is the third and most important area, which I think affects not only Myanmar, but even all of the countries right now, how our food systems, our food supply chains are being disrupted. Well, that, of course, is an addition to the complexity that we face in Myanmar with COVID, climate, and then there's also conflict situation. So that's what I was referring to earlier. That to me is an example of complex system. It's not complicated. It's even complex because there are many unknowns and they're up to it. And I didn't have all the answers, and unfortunately, I didn't solve all the problems, but I came out of it learning a lot.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dindo. That sums up our open forum. Thank you, Dr. Garrity, Dr. Campilan, and Ms. Dyson for that very insightful discussion on initiating change leadership and how adaptive capacity is important. And in addition, especially when you shared your insights about engaging and propelling the youth for leadership roles. I think that was a very important part of the discussion. Before we close this webinar, may I request our speakers for some closing or takeaway message? Let's start with Dr. Garrity.
Well, obviously, my takeaway message draws from my very, very deep concern that the world is on a path to climate catastrophe, and leadership, particularly of our young people, in so many spheres, is going to be absolutely critical. address this. So I hope that, first of all, as Dindo emphasized, we need to learn, we need to understand the true depth of this crisis, and then formulate the urgent call to action, which should be led by the younger generation in every way possible. You know, Greta Thunberg has been telling us for a couple of years now that our house is on fire. But actually, that is just a metaphor for what the data are telling us. And we've got to really come to grips with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dennis. Dr. Dindo?
Yes, I'm very excited to see many familiar faces and names here in the participants list. And for the many others here right now, I think my only message is I want you all to get excited about careers in agriculture and development, rural entrepreneurship, nature conservation. Don't believe the naysayers. It's exciting. And then you look at Dennis, and then you look at Jade and myself. There's a future. And I think it's all about crafting what would be professionally fulfilling to us within this broader domain. So come and join us. Grab the future. It's yours.
Thank you, Dr. Dindo. Ms. Jade?
Thank you. Yeah, I would completely agree. I think agriculture is far more exciting and broad than people realize. And, you know, I think when you look at something like WOMAG and the impact that that's had on our industry in Singapore, it was something that started with a few people around a table only a few years ago. So if you see a problem out there, if you see something that needs addressing, don't be afraid to, you know, give it a go and see what you can do. You'd be surprised, I think, the impact that you can have, particularly leveraging off, you know, relationships and partnerships and you know, that balance between senior leaders and young upcoming leaders. And, you know, I think the transformational leadership is something that's quite centre to our industry at the moment. So I think there's only exciting things to come, but we certainly have some really big challenges ahead of us that need to be addressed. So I look forward to hopefully getting to work with some of you on the call in the future as we continue to tackle them.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Jade. On behalf of our SEARCA, led by our director, Dr. Glenn Gregorio, we would like to express our sincere gratitude to Dr. Garrity, Dr. Campilan, and Ms. Dyson for taking the time to join us today. It has been a pleasure to have you with us this morning. That ends our webinar, but before we close, please let us know what you think about the webinar by following the link to a quick feedback form shown on your screen. The same link will direct you to the request form for the e-certificate, and your feedback will help us improve our online learning events. Please note that we'll only accommodate requests for e-certificates within 24 hours after the end of this webinar. Kindly wait for your e-certificate to be issued at least within a month, as we receive a lot of requests for e-certificates. Thank you for your understanding and patience. Please join us again for our next online conversation on June 23, 2021 at 10 o'clock in the morning. That's a Wednesday again. We have invited speakers who will also talk about their experiences and insights on transformational leadership for agriculture and rural development. The focus this time will be in their capacities as members of the food industry. Please don't miss it. Let us help one another get through this COVID-19 pandemic. We hope that as we go along, we will be able to create a community of better, bigger, and smarter farmers and farming communities. Once again, this is Jean Labius for SEARCA. Have a good day, stay healthy, stay safe, and goodbye, everyone.